evening, everyone, and welcome to the Rose Theatre. I'm Julius Weinberg. I'm Vice-Chancellor at Kingston University, and it gives me great pleasure to see such a stellar array of scholars, guests, and friends here in this wonderful theatre, the Rose, which was, of course, the initiative of Sir Peter Hall, the previous Chancellor and now patron of Kingston University. The fact that Peter was our Chancellor, the fact that we're here, the fact that as a university we have a very close relationship with the Rose just shows how important performance studies, English, the link between the sorts of things that go on here and the university are to us. We support the Rose, we have a fantastic relationship, and in fact our drama students spend a considerable amount of their time here learning the craft of theatre. And it's wonderful for us as a university just down the road to have the building, the relationship, the support that we have here. The link with Sir Peter, and of course now the Sir Peter Hall Professor, who you're going to hear from in a little while. But before you hear from him, universities are successful because they have friends. And our friends are really important to us. There are people who go the extra, who do things for us, who support our students. And that link between the world of practice and the world of study is incredibly valuable, that our students can be exposed to people who every day are crafting plays, working with actors, thinking about what happens within the theatre. And in Stephen Unwin, who was artistic director here at the Rose, we have had a fantastically supportive friend who has helped develop generations of theatre students at Kingston. But not only that, but has also helped develop a broad relationship which brings our students in here to help craft productions if they happen to be Norwegian, to help attend productions because we get a discount, all those things that I as Vice-Chancellor like to hear. So I'm delighted to invite, I'm the introducer of the introducer, so I'm delighted to invite Stephen as a fantastic friend to the university and really an exemplar of the sort of person that within the community helps develop our students. And I think this is the first of Stephen's events in his new role, rather than the last in his old role. So I'm really delighted to invite Stephen to introduce our inaugural speaker. Stephen, thank you.
Thanks very much, Julius. And if universities need friends, theatres sure need friends. And the support and involvement of this university into this extraordinary project over the last however many years, certainly the 6 that I was here, have been quite extraordinary, unlike anything I know anywhere else in Britain. And certainly the achievements that the Rose made, the strides that the Rose made over the last 6 years and will continue to make, are completely reliant, supported by the university, is quite remarkable. Thank you so much, Julius, for those kind words, and I really mean what I'm saying. Now, moving on to the subject tonight. There are 2 Richard Wilsons on my speed dial. And as you can imagine, I've got to be quite careful not to muddle them up when I make my calls. The one is the much-loved Scottish actor who played Victor Meldrew, I'm sure a lot of you know, and just this year directed in this very theatre Richard Bean's scurrilous and brilliant Smack Family Robinson, which, if you like, was a comedy about drug dealers in Surbiton. And it was a hit. And it was a hit. It's funny how theatre is so unpredictable. And the other is the great Shakespearean scholar who it's my pleasure to introduce to you this evening. Now, I first met Richard about 10 years ago when I was preparing a production of Twelfth Night for English Touring Theatre. I'd been bowled over by his book, Willpower, and contacted him to pick his capacious brains. Now, for a theatre director like myself, who's prides himself on having read quite a lot of books, you have to be quite careful about which scholars you go to, because I know I'm confronted by dozens of scholars, but they're not always that useful. Some of them are fantastically useful. And I discovered that Richard was something really, really remarkable. Over red wine and Turkish food, which I think is a typical Richard meal, you know, robust, full-blooded and international. I was struck to find a sensibility and approach to Shakespeare that I found very congenial. Richard roots Shakespeare in his time and place. There are no platitudes about Shakespeare's universal values, no chatter about a dramatist of an eternal present, and no impenetrable abstractions. Instead, he sets Shakespeare firmly in that extraordinarily vivid 100 years between the English Reformation and the Civil War, between two extraordinary moments of historical and social and psychological trauma, if you like. And I think that that is the best possible approach to Shakespeare. I think that that's where we have to start from the time and the place and the history. Now, the introduction of Richard's first full-length study, called Willpower, which I think is an amazing book, 1994, is called The Return of the Author. There is no Shakespeare, I was relieved to discover, without Shakespeare himself somewhere in the midst of it, which came as a great relief to me, having been brought up on decentering the author and those other things which were too difficult for me to understand. Later chapters in this book are called things like Shakespeare and the Cloth Workers, As You Like It and the Enclosure Riots, Representing the Market in Coriolanus. This is a playwright of the real world, engaging imaginatively and poetically with the crises of his day. It seems to me that Richard Shakespeare is a playwright as passionate, as vivid, and as full of conflict as the time he lived in. This view of Shakespeare couldn't be further from the conventional image of the smug propagandist of Protestant England. Instead, he shows a writer caught up in the great spiritual crisis of the time. He knows as much as anybody about the arguments for and against Shakespeare's lost years in Lancashire, through his years in Lancashire, and Shakespeare's Catholic sympathies or not. And his brilliant second book, Secret Shakespeare, shows a playwright living through a time of extraordinary religious violence, a world of Taliban-type cruelty, and astonishing resistance to the new world order of the Elizabethan settlement. So in Richard's eyes, it seems to me, we see a playwright struggling with the great battles of his time. Now, one of the great things about Richard's work, I think, is that while it has its roots in English pragmatism, it's entirely at home in the higher realms of European criticism. And his third book, maybe it's fourth, I've lost track, Shakespeare in French Theory, elucidated for me, certainly, the complex relationship between Shakespeare and Voltaire, gloomy London and the City of Light. Says a huge amount about both of them. And then all of this is written in the most brilliant prose, full of allusion, cross-reference, and flashes of wit. This is not some watery consommé. This is an Italian zuppa di pesce, thick with goodies, mussels and clams, langoustines, and great chunks of garlic. It's flavoursome and tangy, and you want to read it over and over again. I think it's fantastic. I love it. I fall into it like a comfortable bed. So when I heard that there was a possibility of Richard coming here, I did the little I could to persuade the powers that be that this was a brilliant idea. He's had any number of professorships, visiting professorships and distinguished visiting professorships in universities across Britain and crucially at the Sorbonne as well. And I know that some of his comrades from the Sorbonne have come here, bienvenue. He's written, I've already described the three remarkable books of his that I've read, and I'm sure there are others. And he gave me a sneak preview of his latest, Free Will, Art and Power on Shakespeare's Stage, which I think has just been published, which I can't wait. And he's made numerous contributions to a vast range of scholarly editions and works on Shakespeare in his age. I think, to be frank, I think it's a mark of Kingston University's extraordinary and ever-growing ambition and confidence and scope that it has invited a scholar, such a remarkable scholar, but in some ways such a controversial scholar as Richard Wilson here. And I think that's, from my point of view, I think it's marvellous that you've done so. Many congratulations. Finally, I came to the Rose 6 years ago on the invitation of one of the great Shakespearean figures of our time, Peter Hall, founder of the Royal Shakespeare Company, first director of the National Theatre on the South Bank, and still to this day the emeritus director of this theatre. And so it gives me huge pleasure and a sense of Shakespearean rightness. The wheel has come full circle, perhaps. That one of the last things I do as the departing artistic director is to introduce the university's first Sir Peter Hall Professor of Shakespearean Studies for his inaugural lecture, Sermons in Stones, Richard Wilson.
It's always a challenge to follow an introduction as vivid and as charismatic as that one. It's an honour as well to follow such an introduction. It's an honour that any Shakespearean must think almost unimaginable, to be appointed to the first professorship of Shakespeare Studies in the name and in tribute to Sir Peter Hall and in honour of his vision in creating this wonderful theatre and his leadership in the chancellorship of the university that he undertook for so many years with such distinction. That extraordinary combination of being the chancellor and the director, now the director emeritus of this professor, is what the story of my appointment is all about. The combination of the academy and the theatre is the mission that has brought me here. In the year now that I've been here, I've been struck by an uncanny similarity in working between the university and the theatre, and also historic royal palaces at Hampton Court, between the mission that I have here to link the palace, the professoriate, and the playhouse, and Shakespeare's role in also negotiating so many different institutions and so many competing powers. It's been a steep learning curve dealing with such disparate institutions, and to that combination, I'm thrilled to say, in the last few months, Shakespeare's Temple at Hampton has been added, because the great delight and discovery, really, for me, is how important the greatest Shakespearean actor of all time has been to this part of England and to Kingston. David Garrick lived here and built the Shakespeare Temple. And my first conference next summer, next June, will be on Garrick and Shakespeare. So that is typical, I think, of the lucky coincidence of so many influences that I am benefiting from here. When Sir Peter Hall announced his retirement, we could not imagine in the world of literary studies, humanities, and particularly theatre, that a chancellor who was such an eminent director would be followed by a chancellor who is a dramatist. To follow Sir Peter Hall with Bonnie Greer is a wonderful stroke of luck for anyone working in theatre. And in the conversations I've had with Bonnie Greer, she has been tremendously supportive and excited about the Shakespeare project, the Shakespeare programme that we are initiating here. And I know this because I've been getting emails from people who've said, Bonnie Greer has just told me about your Garrick conference. Why don't I know about it? And so on. This is a wonderful lineup, an unimaginably lucky lineup, and I'm extraordinarily lucky and have been with Stephen Unwin at the theatre, with the support and administration at this theatre, and with Robert O'Dowd's leadership of this theatre. Robert O'Dowd makes all this possible and happen. And then, luckiest of all, to have in Martin McQuillan, one of the great deans of all time, I believe one of the great intellectual future public intellectuals of Britain, public intellectuals of this moment in Britain, who has made all this possible in collaboration with Julius, our enlightened despot, who presides over this Renaissance state that so resembles the world that Shakespeare worked in. So I've been dealt with a head of state, an intendant of theatre, a professoriate, an extraordinary lineup, 4 pivotal figures, Bonnie Greer, Julius Weinberg, Robert O'Dowd, and Martin McQuillan in a row. I've been dealt, in fact, a hand of trumps. I've got a full set here of court cards. If it's any kind of court that I'm in, I have the ace, I have the queen, I have the king, and Robert, I have the knave, the jack. I won't go into any more words in different languages about what the knave is called, but I know you'll relish them all. And our jack makes it all possible. And the lineup goes on beyond that. In Ian Brown, I've got an extraordinary colleague in theatre, and Patricia Philippi and Matthew Birchwood too. So the line goes beyond the court cards. I've got a full set of trump cards. And I couldn't be more lucky or more happy than I am. Now, my responsibility, having been given that full set of trump cards, is to play my hand. Sermons in Stones, Shakespeare's dangerous thresholds. The very first words by Shakespeare I ever spoke in public were the lines in As You Like It about sermons in stones. Likely added for the inauguration of the Globe Theatre, the Duke's speech of welcome to the Forest of Arden, encouraging us to substitute talking brooks for books and find our sermons in stones, gets a cool response from educationalists who point out that when it comes to making such a virtue of necessity, only politicians pretend that we're all in this together. But in 1968, the austerity message that less is more seemed the perfect slogan for a production of Shakespeare's pastoral comedy set in the birch grove of a New Age commune and performed by the would-be Woodstock tribe of Thomas Bennett Comprehensive School, Crawley. Sir Thomas Bennett had been the planner of this Newtown subtopia, and the Duke's egalitarian poetry about a life more sweet in these woods than in the envious court struck a chord with the post-war baby boomers of a car-free garden city, as it echoed sweetly enough with a concrete campus in the leafy Sussex Weald. So when the Red Duke sermonized that these stones told us our vita nuova was more free from peril than our former existence, because here we would discover good in everything, the paternalistic old lord was whistling up a matiness about brotherhood and equal opportunity that spoke directly to our welfare state generation, whose free milk and orange juice had indeed given every reason to imagine we had never had it so good. And when the Duke also preached how it was his old Bloomsbury custom of noblesse oblige that validated this simple life, he was doling out to us a sense of entitlement, which no one lucky enough to benefit from the plate glass schools and universities of the 1960s would ever quite forget. Now, my co-mates and brothers in exile, hath not old custom made this life more sweet than that of painted pomp? Are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? Here feel we not the penalty of Adam, the season's difference, as the icy fang and churlish chiding of the winter wind, which when it bites and blows upon my body, even till I shrink with cold, I smile and say, this is no flattery. These are counsellors that feelingly persuade me what I am. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. When Peter Hall blessed the raw foundations of the Rose Theatre with a long-awaited As You Like It in December 2004, reviewers were dismayed that his Arden turned out to be a cold, cheerless forest where you wouldn't want to spend a second longer than necessary. The critics had clearly fallen for the Duke's rosy prospectus, for Hall's chillingly realistic vision was not at all the magical happy comedy as they liked it. But the director had long insisted Shakespeare's forest was a place of terror. And on these same boards in 2010, his Elizabethan A Midsummer Night's Dream again took journalists aback by the starkness of its setting and the fierceness with which Judi Dench decried the climate change of childing autumn, angry winter, in the person of an aging Queen Elizabeth. Similarly, when the plan to create a teaching theatre with Kingston University that Sir Peter had developed with Frank Whately was realised in Stephen Unwin's 2011 As You Like It, the Telegraph objected that the transition from repressive state to the open air of freedom that is usually one of the greatest pleasures of Arden is lost here, where branches aren't changed to suggest approaching summer. What these reviews betrayed, of course, was the gulf between journalistic sentimentality about Shakespeare and the dark reading the directors took from academics such as Anne Barton, who views the comedies as equivalent to Poussin's painting Et in Arcadia Ego, in which the stone that so disconcerts the shepherds who stumble on it in the forest is a tomb that says, "There is no paradise that is not already lost." From this perspective, the Duke's sermon on liberty, equality, and fraternity is truly whistling in the wind. And with its imaginary beating by churls to remind him he is mortal, his speech does in fact seem to be the kind of rite of passage at which Shakespeare's rulers are adept, a calculated act of self-abasement to forestall the opposition by pretending to shun ambition and surrender wealth and ease, which the satirical Jakes calls gypsy cant, blarney to call fools into a circle. If Shakespeare inserted the Duke's communitarian sermon to bless the foundations of the house when the players were forced in 1599 to cross the Thames and build a new theatre outside the city walls, on Bankside, in suburban Surrey, he was obeying a ritual practice that punctuates his plays, where characters regularly sweeten adversity by marking how men that stumble at the threshold are well foretold that danger lurks within. They all make the best of their exits and their entrances. But this is Richard talking about the stones of York, when he warns Edward in 3 Henry VI that finding gates made fast against their arrival spells trouble. Brother, I like not this. Literary theorists tell us that like some endless game of knock knock, who's there, with its perpetual arrivals or uncanny to effect, Shakespeare's art is structured around such thresholds, doors, and walls. For as anyone who directs or acts in these plays, as I did here in All's Well, soon realizes, our Bertram is in the audience, this is a dramaturgy that prefigures the idea of liminality developed by anthropologists like Arnold van Gennep. That the process of initiating a new project by crossing a threshold, carrying the bride, toasting New Year, or leaving the house is both a danger and an opportunity, testing our ability to grow and change. So the Yorkist usurper is unfazed when the mayor bolts Bootham Bar. Tush, man, abodements must not now frighten us. By fair means or foul, we must enter in. And sure enough, this knocking on the gates of York turns out to be purely symbolic, like the hammering of the Queen's messenger, Black Rod, on the door of the House of Commons. For Edward is handed the keys to the city after he eats humble pie, and purporting to forget our title to the crown, is allowed to proceed into York as a loyal subject of the king, being well content with that alone. Once across the dangerous threshold, of course, the interloper can be proclaimed the king himself. And we are reminded of Shakespeare as poacher turned gamekeeper, when in Dominic Guarblanque's sardonic critical commentary, fortune smiles upon the gatecrasher. In Shakespeare's consensus politics, the price of office is to wear the gown of humility and ask it kindly. But the cynical Machiavellian moral Richard draws that this stooping duty of mock modesty is an empty form, because when the fox has once got in his nose, he'll soon find means to make the body follow. I also suspected, when my 1968 came to its abrupt end, with an arrogant but abortive interview to enter York myself to study history. Like the clown Costard in Love's Labour's Lost, I could say, I fell over the threshold and broke my shin. So I will always be grateful to my teachers, who during that heady summer of the events spared me a lifetime in insurance by allowing me to return to school, a superannuated sixth former, to follow the nose of the fox by reapplying as a displaced historian, so ever slightly out of sync, to York's legendary Department of English and Related Literature instead. Barred from history at York, I learned there instead that, as the founding chair of English, Philip Brockbank, wrote magisterially in his essay on the Henry VI epic, Shakespeare dispenses with the vulgar historicism that truth is coextensive with the facts to reveal a more significant movement of the way the facts are dressed. This emphasis on story over history, acting over actuality, was new historicism, avant la lettre, for which I had already been primed by my history teacher, David Whittaker, who is here, who, whether flashing the red tie on an election day or hamming up the Queen's speech in dragon regalia at the state opening of our school debating society, had shown us all how all the world's a stage and all the men and women in it merely players. Both these inspirational teachers were therefore in tune with a Shakespeare interpretation that more than any other reflected Britain's cultural politics in the 1960s, and that is arguably the real reason we are here today. Peter Hall's epoch-marking Stratford production of the Histories, The Wars of the Roses. That we are all gathered here like Jaques fools within the circle of this wooden O, that while reproducing the dimensions of a playhouse of 1587, has been built as a flexible building with modern materials and the capacity to change, that he calls his ideal acting space and auditorium, and says he has been imagining all his life, is a lasting testimony to Sir Peter's persuasive faith in what he terms the pressure of now, pulsing through Shakespeare's language, plays, and world. For in this theatre, modelled on the excavations of the Bankside Rose, the populist playhouse, where the Henry VI cycle was first performed, we can recognise the final material shape of Hall's lifelong mission to present Shakespeare as our contemporary. Jan Cott's 1964 book of that title was, of course, The Cue, when Hall and John Barton rewrote the text to create The Wars of the Roses. For Hall had been famously stunned by Shakespeare, our contemporary, when he read a proof on the train to Stratford. And I, too, recall my wild teenage surmise on first looking into this amazing and modern work of criticism, not only in reaction to its horror-comic graphics of the grand mechanism of history, but to the machine-like rhetoric with which the Polish émigré traced the recurring and unchanging circles that always terminate in a monarch's death and a new coronation. As Carol Rutter and Stuart Hampton Reeves admit in their fine performance study of the histories, we academics have underestimated Hall's radicalism, for through Cott he was discovering just how the same sanctions, God, the King, the Church, survived in 1960s Whitehall as the legitimating fictions politicians used to mask their naked ambitions. So it's telling that my own most intense memory of the televised Wars of the Roses is of Ian Holmes' Richard, flinging aside both his prayer book and false humility, and then kicking his heels in childlike glee after the citizens had been bamboozled into begging him to submit to the solemn sanctimoniousness of a coronation. Tomorrow may it please you be crowned, even as you please, for you will have it so. Tomorrow then we will attend your grace, and so most joyfully we take your leave. Come, let us to our holy work again. In Peter Hall's Richard III, the holy work of crowning and consecration was demystified as merely the most histrionic of what he called the contortions and seductions practiced by anyone who wields power, when the bishops instructing the devilish monarch were unmasked as his own thugs. Hall was taking a hint from his Tudor namesake, who considered Richard's coronation a joke. Guablanque again. In Hall's chronicle, she writes, "The monks sing the Te Deum with faint courage, but soon everyone gets into the spirit of the party, and a good time is had by all." So the director's iconoclasm was by way of stripping the plays down to expose how the mechanism of power had not changed in centuries. A forensic analysis he attributed less to Brecht than his lecturer F.R. Leavis, when he recounted that influenced by Leavis, we were not asking if something nice was dialectically honest, but whether something nice was necessary. Cambridge rigour. We were taking away scenery, costumes, plumminess, music from the text, and crowns from the princes. Knocking the hollow crowns off princes was indeed still Dr. Leavis's rigorous scientific method. When I sat in on his dawn seminars at York in the 1970s and listened in frozen fascination to his boasting yet again how when Olivier wrote to thank him for his essay on Othello's insincerity, he had slapped the insolent mummer down. A weather-beaten exiled duke, if ever there was one. Leavis's contempt for the falsity of theatre was notorious, and his scorn for mere players makes it all the more striking that so many directors have shared Hall's ambition to think like Leavis by scrutinising why a line is structured as it is, what is underneath it, what is it all about. But when I hear my York contemporary, David Thacker, earnestly quizzing young actors at Bolton Octagon, what does it mean? I realise that while no one in the university now reads his books, Leavis's legacy lives on in the theatre. In the belief Hall says that those wintry lectures gave him, that art is more important than religion, as the only way of passing the past on to the future. So I don't believe the turbulent priest who sermonised at us at York was, in Stephen Fry's elegant phrase, a sanctimonious prick of only parochial significance. Instead, I believe it was Lewis's manic preaching that let us take ourselves so seriously in the York University Drama Society. Even when a production like Bill Pride's Gold Lyric's Timon of Athens, where we crossed all bounds of taste, was inspired by Fellini. So it is certainly comical that he hated the theatre and never went to it, when he had more influence on the British stage than any other critic, as Hall wrote in his diary on the day the Doctor died. But having been initiated into the icy fang and churlish chiding of those puritanical seminars, we can say it was no coincidence that this was the narrow door through which we came. The one time I performed in Lewis's presence, for a York recital of The Wasteland, done in different voices, he stood beside the podium, shaking his head throughout my rendition of the Shakespeare parts, trippingly on the tongue, as our tutor, the Eliot scholar David Moody, had coached us. I see him shaking his head now. Because what I had to contend with was a signal of the trouble Lewis's anti-theatricalism caused Shakespeareans, his acid scorn for the pretensions of the music he derided in what Sir Laurence Olivier, say, does to Shakespeare. So our journey to the Rose could be described as one long retreat from Richard's Lewisite sneer about performance as an empty form towards appreciation that, as Sir Peter countered in his own Cambridge lectures exposed by the Mask, Shakespeare presents a perfect expression of creative tension between form and feeling. The feeling must be there, but the form must contain it. Here is the paradox. By hiding feeling, you reveal it. Thus, Hall came to regret the liberties that he'd taken with the text when he understood how Shakespeare's verse is his quickest means of communication. And that is why the Rose Foundations became his template here at Kingston, when excavations revealed not a thrust stage, but a traverse, because the form of the play, he came to think, is shaped by the physical conditions that give rise to it. And so only a theatre constructed like the People's Bankside Playhouse would have the exits and the entrances working with the rhythm of the text. Shakespeare, writes Hall, is adept at making entrances, and their rhythm is always crafted into what is spoken. Sometimes there is a sudden appearance from one of the doors. Sometimes there is a long preparation as actors walk down to take possession of centre stage. This is why the Rose is a stage that is easy to keep hot. As one scene ends and the actors leave the commanding acting space, the characters of the next scene possess it. There are no pauses between scenes, because no pauses are needed, and certainly no illustrative music. All modern Shakespeare theatres are too large, Peter Hall believes. And he admits his dream is a small theatre with a vast sum of money. So I could teach Shakespeare by performing him. In practice, our new Rose is a culmination of Hall's resistance to the thrust stage, typified by the Stratford Swan, where he says it's impossible for the majority of the audience to see the actor when he is downstage, a platform he likens to a diving board, memorable for the entrance, but anticlimactic. By contrast, enthusiasts predicted Kingston's rosy future would spring from its encouragement of a bold, frontal presentational style of acting, since, as Peter Holland reported, this traverse asks the audience to watch a broad sweep of drama, unimpeded. This wide and universal theatre is therefore itself a challenging threshold. that requires performers to rise to the occasion. And it's for this reason that its creator has become such a vocal critic of the pillars at the reconstructed Globe. For according to Hall, the actors who designed the original Globe did not build a theatre where large pillars hide them completely on their first entrance. So nowhere in the plays, he maintains, is there any mention of the obstructed sight lines that come with such a monumental construction. Here, however, I have to disagree with Sir Peter, because in my new book, Free Will, Art and Power on Shakespeare's Stage, I look intently at the inaugural speeches delivered at the Globe and conclude that of all the dangerous thresholds the dramatist imagined crossing, it was the grand portico of this classical tiring house which caused Shakespeare deepest worry. In fact, the texts of the foundation Globe tragedy, Julius Caesar, can be decoded at a technical level, I conclude, as a theatre professional's sceptical survey of the architectural features of the 1599 playhouse, and a warning that their shadows seem a canopy most fatal, under which our army lies ready to give up the ghost. If Julius Caesar was devised for the gala opening of the Globe as the upmarket rival to the Democratic Rose, the surprising subtext of its theatre imagery is that Shakespeare's company found their grandiose new home dispiriting. For by cementing as its inescapable visual focus a backdrop that would always symbolize the stones and gates of Rome, even when a comedy was staged, the conclave Globe repeated the old confusion between the People's Circus and a political forum. So, no wonder the Duke's merry men crown the boy that kills the deer like a Roman conqueror in the blooding ritual, which comes as such a shock in As You Like It, since scholars do trace the Globe facade to pictures of the Roman victory parade like Mantegna's at Hampton Court, showing the wheeled seat of great Caesar windowed, as Antony objects, by way of the arches erected for Renaissance imperial processions. Most of all, they assert, the Globe had the look of a triumphal arch, a claim recently restated by the British Museum director, Neil MacGregor. Shakespeare's plays were performed in front of a permanent, temporary, triumphal march. Triumphal arch. In his classic study, Shakespeare's Festive World, Francois Larocque, however, describes the fantastic Baroque arches put up for the coronation of King James in 1604 as gateways to a new age of pomp and ceremony, when, he writes, public festivals would exclude popular participation to become purely formal spectacles. So specialists debate whether Shakespeare's tiring house had an equalizing pair of openings or was centrally three-nooked. For if the consensus is that the Globe's proscenium effect derived from such royal entries, Andrew Gurr points out that in Julius Caesar this framing is expressly identified with absolutist tyranny, when it is said, Caesar bestrides the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about. Stay for me in Pompey's porch. Repair to Pompey's theatre. The Globe's foundation story keeps harping on the fact that it takes place in Rome's original playhouse, which Caesar's rival also built for the Senate to meet in the giant foyer, thus making theatre literally a political lobby. Likewise, experts calculate that with huge legs, supporting the wide arch of the Ranged Empire, topped by a statue of massive Hercules and his load, the towering house that bestrides the narrow world of the 1616 globe, in Holler's illustration, would have thrown the actors into permanent shadow. No wonder, if this is how it stood in 1599, that Shakespeare's Romans argue over the direction of the sun, Casca insisting, "Here, as I point my sword, the sun rises," since the scale of this most excellent canopy would have put them all in the shade. So, indeed, the extent of the heavens would seem to make extra lighting imperative on this stage. So while the globe's majestical roof, fretted with golden fire, may have been equipped for spectacular special effects, like the descent of the god Hymen in As You Like It, it would be understandable if the actors, forced to peep about its pillars of Hercules, felt troubled by this glorified fly tower, with its marbleized busts, caryatids, obelisks, pilasters, and urns, ascending to the dazzling polychromatic heavens that Caesar vaingloriously associates with his divine right kingship as the deus ex machina. The skies are painted with unnumbered sparks. They are all fire, and every one doth shine. Yet in the number I do know but one, that unassailable holds his rank, unshaked of motion. Theatre architects like Nick Helm stress that a classical theatre design is always politically loaded, since Roman theatre positioned actors in front of a facade that dominated the stage. So when Shakespeare's players wonder, "Whoever knew the heavens menace so?" and answer, "Those that have known the earth so full of faults," it is tempting to hear these faults as the trouble with the globe. Editors note, for instance, that the scene where Brutus and Cassius imagine the citizens choose Caesar for their king is the only time in all Shakespeare where on-stage action depends on unseen space, as if the true subject of this tragedy is how its actors are upstaged. Considering the story has such a global impact, it is indeed ironic how little anyone can see. So Ellen Sixou is not alone in sensing that history is at the door in Julius Caesar, even if we are kept in the dark about who it is that knocks. But Elizabethan tourists in fact assumed that because they imitated the imperial splendor of the Colosseum, London's amphitheatres were designed to house and welcome a Roman emperor of the modern kind, like the autocratic King James. So with this globe opener, we are not allowed to forget the arena had been a place where so many Romans came smiling to feast on blood. A troubling, violent heritage that Andreas Hofehler thinks was what confused the artist Holler into mislabeling the globe a bear-baiting. And Shakespeare's characters truly shake in trepidation at crossing this dangerous threshold. Danger knows full well that Caesar is more dangerous. The dictator therefore brags when he announces he will not stay at home on his coronation day, since Caesar will go forth. His whole career has involved crossing such Rubicons, as when he raced Cassius across the Tiber. But troubled as this tragedy of doors and portents is by its own liminality, in light of the superstitious importance attached to all portals, casements, corners, doorsteps, gates, lintels, or sills, Shakespeare's trouble in blessing the foundation stone is itself portentous. Disrobe the images if you to find them decked with ceremonies. Let no images be hung with Caesar's trophies. One of the difficulties about glorifying Shakespeare's globe is that his references to the Bankside Playhouse are so negative. Sometimes these are actors' criticisms, such as Achilles in Troilus and Cressida, about an echo formed by the applause, by the arch, which has a tendency to reverberate the voice again. Others are audience complaints, like Hamlet's disgust that the brave overhanging traps a foul and pestilent congregation of vapours. But the objections all come back to the way that old stagers struggle in what the Prince calls this distracted globe. For as David Thacker once said to me, "You will never see a production at the Globe more interesting than the place." And in 1599, the opening spelled out the politics of that distraction, when it had Antony go up into the public chair, the balcony of the tiring house, to exploit this pulpit and create havoc with a monarch's voice by inciting a riot that seems an eerie premonition of how the great globe itself would burn to the ground. Historians describe the early modern pulpit as a royal mouthpiece and a symbol of empire that amplified absolutism. So it's significant that this is the only time Shakespeare ever introduces this ideological apparatus, and that its intrusion here demonstrates how theatre is about to be taken over by incendiary preaching. Its wooden circle made the Globe an extraordinarily efficient machine, we are assured, for propagating sound. But if this premier Globe play is to be believed, Shakespeare's stage had also been converted into a medium for the political violence that would eventually pluck down the benches, forms, windows, anything of the playhouse itself. To anyone brought up on Olivia's Henry V, with its romance of a democratic globe, the shock of Shakespeare's Inaugural is its aversion to blessing the house, which is shown to be haunted by evil spirits, with the phantom of the playhouse a spectre of theatre perverted by demagogues like Antony. Thus, the cobbler, who jokes at the start that he comes to stick his big awl in this gaping hole, looks like a portrait of the artist as naughty young Will of the Rose, the glover's son and mender of bad souls, claiming the best-dressed walk on his goat's leather. Intellectuals obsess on shoes or shoemakers, like Hans Sachs in Meistersinger, theorizes Jacques Rancière in The Philosopher and His Poor, because these true fundamentalists radicalize old forms. So, if Shakespeare's troupe had proceeded on these foundations, the myth of monarchy would have been treated like the cobblers the tag-rag people make of Caesar's crowning, when they clap and hiss him, as they used to do the players in the theatre. For Caesar's crown is no authentic regalia, but one of these coronets, of a piece with a hollow crown in the histories Shakespeare wrote for the Rose and the theatre in Shoreditch, where he was reminding audiences, "'Tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings," just as men like Raleigh were arguing that when the Queen died, the wisest way was to establish a republic. As Roy Strong laments, in these plays, demystification of monarchy was taken to an almost Puritan extreme, with the rejection of the fabricated image and its ritual. Yet no sooner has the revolutionary cobbler trespassed onto the threshold of the Globe than this clown from the Rose is told he is out of bounds and ordered home. And Julius Caesar proceeds instead with the tragicomedy of Cinna. The type of court artist Shakespeare must have feared he would become if he crossed the threshold of power, the poet as political propagandist. "I dreamt tonight that I did feast with Caesar, and things unlucky charged my fantasy. I have no will to wander forth of doors, yet something leads me forth. What is it about the doorway that makes it so productive for painting and literature? A place where, as Derrida puts it, one may avoid speaking, yet speak. Ask the essayists in a recent collection, Thinking on Thresholds. The reason they offer is that this troubling interface between inside and outside, private and public, sleeping and waking, is such an apt metaphor for artistic creativity itself. Thus, the challenge of the liminal as an experience of what Hamlet calls the readiness is prefigured in this first Globe play, when Brutus reflects that between thought and action, the interim is a phantasm. And critics see this suspended consciousness on the eve of a coup as a watershed, when something new emerges in world drama, a mental crisis about performance, as the author weighs the trouble if I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. Each play he wrote after 1599 is troubled by a similar prevaricating pause, the hesitation when a speaker dries and, like a neutral to his will and matter, does nothing. That seems keyed to conditions at the Globe, where it is said we often see the orb below as harsh as death, in patient expectation of a prompt. Shakespeare is transfixed whenever actors throttle their practiced accents in their fears. And biographers speculate that he may even have been a stutterer himself. But from the instant he stepped onto the stage of the Globe, he turned his stage fright to dramatic advantage, with the consolation that silence shall be most my glory, being dumb. Thus, the troubled temporizer at the door would suggest a way to speak without speaking, for it is precisely when sinner ceases to hesitate on that ominous threshold and wanders forth of doors, dreaming of hobnobbing with Caesar, that this court poet is lynched by Antony's vigilantes for his bad verses. On May the 15th, 1604, the Lord Chamberlain's office minuted payment for the scarlet livery worn by William Shakespeare as a groom of the chamber in King James's royal entry into London. The things unlucky he dreaded on the threshold of the new century had all come true when his company was incorporated as the King's Men, and the most democratic organisation in England came under the patronage of the most despotic figure in the country. The new King's Man had probably to pose beneath one of the arches heralding James as Caesar. But judging by the sonnets he penned at this time, which scorned these pyramids of smiling pomp, Shakespeare felt no glory in this initiation as a serving man, proud in heart and mind, that curled my hair, wore gloves in my cap. Were it aught to me, I bore the canopy, he shrugged, with my extern the outward honouring. No, let me be poor but free. His craven stooping in rustling silks instead looks to have provided our bending author with a scenario for his Jacobean plays. In the inauguration problem, he now staged over and over again of someone who feels his title hang loose about him, like a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief. So in Free Will, I conclude that in his late plays, Shakespeare outfaced Stuart absolutism by dramatising the legend of the beggar king, where a monarch to whom all have bowed like Leontes, discovers he must kneel himself. But in my earlier Secret Shakespeare, I argued that he had already created a song and dance out of his own investiture crisis by repeatedly opening his plays with some act of resistance to perform at court. "'Tis not alone my inky cloak, nor customary suits of solemn black, nor windy suspiration of forced breath, no, nor the fruitful river of the eye, nor the dejected haviour of the visage, together with all the forms, moods, shows of grief that can denote me truly. These indeed seem, for they are actions that a man might play, but I have that within which passes show. These but the suits and trappings of my woe." Like Hamlet, Shakespeare was publicly attacked for refusing to perform on command. For in 1603, when according to Thomas Decker's almanac, The Wonderful Year, the grieving poets of England rained showers of tears over the body of Elizabeth, Shakespeare's refusal to mourn contrasted with royalist hysteria, and within weeks of her death, a mournful ditty entitled England's Loss was bullying the poet to bestow your time to write for England's Queen. In the sonnet he did write about the drops of this most balmy time, when the mortal moon her eclipse endured, he shed no tears over those Tudor tyrants' crests and tombs of brass in the abbey. But he was equally doubtful about James's coronation there, of which the best he could say was, "Incertainties now crown themselves assured." Shakespeare had implied in Richard II how the medieval belief that not all the water in the rough-rude sea can wash the balm from an anointed king was as balmy as the ruler who carried the holy chrism around his neck in the ampulla in which the Virgin was said to have dispensed it to St. Thomas. And in Sonnet 107, the drops of olive oil, supposed to consecrate James as Christ's anointed, were synthetically blended with those crocodile tears for Elizabeth. So despite everything we are told on TV or in Shakespeare in Love about the bard and Britain's balmy royals, there was no love lost between this poet and his prince. For a paradigm shift over recent years has been our realization that if Shakespeare was no Republican, his theme of proud majesty made subject positions his work as one of the intellectual origins of the English Revolution. Critics have therefore gone back to his references to the arcane political theology of the king's two bodies for the reason set out by historian Ernst Kantorowicz, that without this crucial legal split of the office from the person, it would have been impossible for the so-called crown to cut off King Charles's balmy head. But the question this regicidal turn prompts is, if Shakespeare was one of the king's men, where did he get the freedom to joke so cruelly that the body is with the king, but the king is not with the body? The king is a thing of nothing. Early in his 2004 series In Search of Shakespeare, on which I was lucky enough to work, Michael Wood, who sends his blessings to us, he's actually flying to China at this moment and is unhappy not to be with us. Michael Wood took viewers to the River Ribble in Lancashire, where he pictured the future dramatist as a teenager out on the cold, dark estuary, like one that stands upon a promontory and spies a far-off shore where he would tread, and chides the sea that sunders him from thence. The theory that the Warwickshire boy served as a tutor in the Catholic household at Horton Tower in Lancashire, which was aired in the TV series and My Secret Shakespeare, was attacked with livid aggression by the editorial establishment, which seized on a verdict of not proven from Stratford's archivist to wish it into oblivion. But 5 of Stratford's Elizabethan schoolmasters came from the Ribble Valley, and imagining their pupil on a dangerous threshold in recusant Lancashire provided the most plausible context yet for the existential choice that is a starting point for so many of his plays, of whether to take arms against a sea of troubles and, by opposing, end them. So the research project Alison Findlay and I ran at Lancaster University was to relate Shakespeare's theatre of resistance to the northern venues of travelling players and the non-metropolitan culture founded in the independent, educational and legal structures of the duchy of time-honoured Lancaster that was still sermonised in stones on the Balerig campus. It was no accident, we discovered, that so many players, such as the star of the Rose, Richard Allen, came from this heartland of religious nonconformity. For there was a direct line tying the subversive question, is it not passing brave to be a king, posed by Ferdinando Stanley's or Lord Strange's men at the Rose, with the resistance politics of the Lancastrian sponsors? So nor perhaps was it chance that the first person to record the alternative constitutional tradition commemorated here at Kingston was from the same northwest, and that the original chronicler of the King's Stone, which stands today outside the Rose, should have hailed from a redoubt of the Stanley country at Farndon in Cheshire. John Speed's interest in Kingston's megalith was perhaps piqued by the fact that the first Saxon king consecrated on it, Edward the Elder, died in 924 in his own village of Farndon, the only significant thing ever to happen there. But when he annotated in his 1627 atlas that at Kingston stood the chair of majesty whereon Athelstan, Edwin and Ethelred sate at their coronations and first received the sceptre of imperial power, the cartographer had a more urgent spur in the coronation of Charles I. According to Strong, Charles's 1626 crowning touched the heart of the constitutional conflict of the age, when divine right was ritualized by Archbishop Laud with a new mix of the holy oil, compounded of orange, jasmine, cinnamon, benzoin, ambergris, musk, and civet, an Asiatic concoction even James would have hesitated to apply to his head, and a new amendment to the oath, requiring the king to obey only laws agreeing to the prerogative. It was for this alteration that Charles and Laud would eventually be condemned to death. For Parliament had wanted the king to take his oath on the gospel on which the Anglo-Saxon kings swore theirs, but on the day this was accidentally on purpose mislaid, and the oath was sworn on the Bible of the Chapel Royal. Thus, by evading the gospel, Charles was able to disavow the Anglo-Saxon history of elective monarchy and base his right on the usurpation of William the Conqueror, the bastard of Normandy, who made himself king by force and with a mighty army, in James's words, and gave the law and took none. As the historian Christopher Hill and my own teacher, David Whittaker, taught me, this debate about the Norman yoke was crucial in the battle of ideas before the Civil War. And it meant that when Speed recorded the chair of majesty at Kingston, he was confronting Charles's sacred kingship with a different contractual and consensual politics evolved by the oppositional Society of Antiquaries and based on the myth that before 1066 the Anglo-Saxons lived as free and equal citizens, governing themselves through representative institutions. Until the 20th century, few seem to have doubted the significance of Kingston's so-called coronation stone as a foundation of parliamentary democracy. But its migration from All Saints' Church to the town hall in Market Place, to a traffic island outside Clatton House to its shadowy obscurity behind the police station is the story of the gradual eclipse of the Whig myth of the ancient constitution by the mystique of hereditary monarchy. In 1889, Jerome K. Jerome came ashore in 3 men in a boat to muse upon the days when Saxon kingers were crowned upon it. And as late as 1908, highways and byways of Surrey could misinform travellers that the stone was a throne on which the chief sat in council with his great men, predecessors of Anglo-Saxon chiefs, the arch-druids. But the coronation of Edward VII in 1902 had relaunched the House of Saxe-Coburg with the invention of modern monarchy. And in the 20th century, the idea of elective sovereignty was pushed so far out of sight that the sandstone lump became a seeming embarrassment to the royal borough, its authenticity questioned by local historians, and its function downgraded to an Elizabethan foot scraper. Tellingly, in Michael Wood's recent TV series, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was quoted stating that in 925, Athelstan was consecrated at Kingston, but an image of the stone flashed on screen with no comment. Sarsen means trouble stone in Anglo-Saxon, and Kingston's Anglo-Saxon sarsen is nothing if not a troublemaker. I hear that trouble stone rumbling whenever I read Martin McQuillan's Savonarolan sermons in the THES. But what light can the researchers of Kingston's University now shed on its most troubled monument? And what sermon would be most meaningful here at the Rose on the subject of its troublesome neighbour? In the coronation play he wrote for his Scottish ruler, Shakespeare cast a cold eye on the mystical foundation of authority, the belief that meaning can be whole as marble, founded as the rock of some King Arthur, dubious of unswept stone, besmeared with sluttish time. He knew the globe itself would leave not a rack behind, and no brass nor stone, but sad mortality o'ersways their power. And as my student Johann Gregory has just shown in his brilliant PhD thesis, placed little faith in the promises they inspire when water drops have worn the stones of Troy. So my own first book, Willpower, opened with a satire in 2 Henry VI, where Jack Cade sits upon the London stone, promising the pissing conduit will run claret wine. But Shakespeare's Scottish play turns on an uncanny sense that there are promising places, like a church or a theatre, where language is performative, being, as Peter Hall believes, shaped by the space. So in a most troubling scene, Malcolm insults himself with false accusations before Edward the Confessor's throne in the Abbey, the better to become his country's to command. The episode defers to Scotland's Stone of Scone, placed beneath the throne at James's coronation. Michael Wood tells us that something similar occurred at Kingston, where a deal was brokered before Athelstan's anointing with the oil, and in the church the king performed acts of humility, freeing a slave and prostrating himself on the ground to signify his oaths were not just pious hopes. The king's unmarried status and favours to handsome youths provoke our anachronistic query: was Athelstan gay? But Wood deciphers his self-subjection as symbolic of a new separation of the office from the man. And this fits the latest thinking, that the King's Stone was in fact the threshold of Kingston Saxon Minster, demarcating the division between church and state, the kingdom and the glory that philosopher Giorgio Agamben sees as the inception of Western democracy, encoded in the legend of the weak or fisher king who goes fishing because he does not rule but reigns. So Athelstan made himself a luminary by lying face down on the stone threshold at his inauguration. The Anglo-Saxon king was lucky because in Celtic Ireland, kings were inaugurated by being led from the installation stone to have sex with a white mare. That was then slaughtered to provide the cauldron of horse stew in which the new monarch was required to sit and bathe as he ate and fed the broth to his supporters. Anyone who wants office must be prepared to suffer for it. These troubling rituals seem to say. But were these demeaning inaugurations simply legitimating fictions? The cunning tricks of King Ubu, as Michel Foucault termed all such performances of pretended weakness? Were the Duke's progressive sermons all a cheat, and the Newtown promise of Crawley only another name for the politics of Downton Abbey? The promising place where I am inaugurated permits its incumbent to answer these troubling doubts by speaking ex cathedra, swearing in the democratic tradition Shakespeare took from the People's Rose and that Peter Hall gave to its successor here in Kingston, to strive to make this office greater than the man. Because in the words I bring this house from my last threshold and the Millennium Centre in Cardiff, in these stones horizons sing.